Thanks for joining us. I'd like to welcome you all to AMBA's webinar, Improving Sales Performance with the Right Data, which will be presented by Lori Harbour and James Murphy with Harbour Results. I want to remind everyone that we will do question and answers at the end of the presentation. We'll keep everyone in listen-only mode until then, and then using that question feature from the software at the end, I will ask the questions that are sent in. After the webinar has completed, we will be uploading the recording as well as the presentation to the AMBA's website. And with that said, I will let Lori go ahead and get started. Thanks, Lori.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to this AMBA group. It's a pleasure for James and I to talk with you today and share some thoughts about sales performance. We want to talk today about improving sales performance and starting with using the right data in your analysis. So as we get started, I think most of you know our organization. We are a consulting firm that is working within the tool and die space as well as other processes such as stamping and molding and precision metals. Our focus really is on improving manufacturing in the U.S., and we're doing that through working with companies on operational improvement and on facilitation of strategic planning and then the implementation of those objectives. We also have our two-day assessment process that we do about 50 assessments a year of manufacturing companies, and then we're doing custom benchmarking for companies. So when companies are looking for specific data on new markets to enter or certain types of equipment or processes, we are doing some specific benchmarking there. And then lastly, we have our Harbour IQ client service offering where we're working with companies strategically utilizing data and information to help them make decisions in their business. So we'll move past that and jump into our content today. And as we get started, we want to kind of start with why are we here and why are we focused on sales performance? You know, in the old days, for many of the tool shops that we have visited, sales seemed to sort of just come to them, and profits were good, and it wasn't quite a hurdle to have multiple opportunities to be able to find new customers and find new projects. But as the recession hit, and of course the pressure from things like cost control from our customers, but also overseas from China, it became much more challenging for tool shops to have those sales sort of just come to them on an easier basis. And today, very few mold shops that we have visited have strategic sales processes or plans that they're using with new customers or to even grow within some of their current customers. And so without a sales plan, basically the sales teams are going out and they're making calls and they're trying to get sales, oftentimes without a specific focus or on what type of sales is good for our organization. And so over the last year or so, as we've been visiting tool shops, probably the number one concern that we hear on a consistent basis is the lack of sales or the inability to forecast the peaks and valleys in our business. So what tends to happen is that shops that don't have a plan or don't have that consistent flow and process tend to operate much like this orange line that you see, in that there's several peaks and valleys or up and downs in the business with huge swings in profitability. So as we drop into the valley, we tend to go out and take on unprofitable work and do different things that has an impact on our overall flow of business as well as profit. But then, of course, we'll hit the peaks and we tend to outsource work, and that takes away some of our profitability as well. And so those companies who have figured out how to kind of run more in this line that you see, this blue line that you see, which is still got some peaks and valleys to it, never going to be a smooth surface, but ultimately are able to level the peaks and valleys at some pace, have been able to achieve better profitability, better future forecasting, better visibility, and just overall better operations as they go forward. And so because it's one of the things that we tend to see so much of lately, we wanted to focus on sales today. And if I show you just some current data, you don't have to look very far than sort of the last 6 to 8 months and then the plan going forward and on why this is such a big impact for shops. This is actual capacity utilization data that we collect through Harbour IQ. We ask companies to provide us with what the last 12 months looks like, and then what's a forecast going forward for the next 12 months in terms of utilization. And you can see there was a significant drop in utilization in the fourth quarter and into the first quarter of this year. And going forward, although there's a return to it, there's still not necessarily numbers that we're seeing well over 90 to 100%. There's still a lot of conservative nature in the industry. And so as you look at this, one of the things affecting it, we also collect a piece of data called jobs on hold or work on hold. And we ask companies, how much work do you have on hold in a given quarter? And we look at that on a quarterly basis. And so you can see in August of last year, it was about 12%, and then by January, it had gone to 20%. So some of this dip is an actual dip in the industry and in programs, and some of it's also what we would call a slip in the industry or delays in programs that now we're starting to see some heavier launch activity in. So the data's real, and when we look at this and companies are struggling to figure out how do we level that load, that's what drives us to looking at sales performance. If you look at some of the growing challenges in the market, you've got a huge focus on cost control across all industries, certainly not just automotive, but we're seeing it in medical and aerospace. You've got international pressures, more tools still coming from China, coming from other regions of the world. You've got a larger global capacity than ever that companies are relying upon. And then higher expectations of customers, higher expectations for quality, higher expectations for timing and delivery, and program management, one of those areas that they want to see much more diligence to. And of course, you've got growing complexity of product. No matter what industry, again, that we're in, appliances, medical, we're seeing huge complexity of tools. And so in today's environment, these challenges become more and more difficult for companies to balance. How do they go about the appropriate sales approach to level their load and manage their business? And when you look at various industries going forward that many of you operate in, frankly, the growth rates are very modest across many of these. Doesn't matter which segment you're in. We're only seeing an average of 1 to 2% growth rate in several of the industries that AMBA members are operating in. And so it's very difficult to say, hey, I'm going to pick this market because it's booming and we can expect a lot of growth. Let's focus on that. And so when you see modest growth rate, it means you have to develop a strategy in the segments you're in to figure out how do we grow within customers and how do we gain new customers. So on this next chart, we are looking at really what most shops need these days as we go traveling across the U.S. and look at shops is this focus on more of a strategic sales process. For those of you who are at the AMBA conference, I showed a variation of this as well, and we talked a little bit about where the opportunities are. Now, there's a lot of things on this chart. And as I mentioned, many shops don't have a full strategic plan or process, but they might have bits and pieces of this. Many of you are gathering data for your quotes and tracking your quotes and are looking at your margins on projects. You may have a company strategic plan. You may do some forecasting. But the reality of it is that success comes when a company builds the right process for their business. It may not include every one of these steps, but it's examining what's important for your organization, be it a big company or a small company, and how these steps work within your flow of either data or information and your staff that you have on board to manage each of these elements of the process. Either way you look at it, it starts with a company strategy and what your core capabilities are, what your organization looks like, what your niche in the business is, and then ultimately goes through how do we define our target markets, how do we do our pricing and quoting, what data do we look at, and then how do we create feedback loops that are constantly challenging us to look at our company strategy. And then the sales planning that goes with that is frankly the very tactical elements of how do we go visit our customers and talk to them, and how do we manage them. And lastly, it's how does it tie to operations, and what do we need to come out of the front end of the process to drive that operational planning. And so this is a very complex and difficult process, and what we wanted to do is start a little bit with showing you some very tactical analysis of where companies could get started. And we want to dive a little bit deeper into sales and profitability analysis, which you see under the data analysis category. And James Murphy, who works on our team, is going to kind of walk you through a very tactical example of where you could start to look at data and information and what questions that might lead you to think about, and then where you might go from there. And then as we move forward in our work with the AMBA, if it makes sense for us to have a phase 2 discussion of this webinar, as companies begin to gather data, we're certainly open to be able to do that. So at this point, what I want to do is turn it over to James, and he's going to walk through, as I said, this example. James is on our consulting team, and he spends a lot of time working with mold shops and processors on both consulting and data analysis, but also strategy within their business. And sales is one of those areas that he's been working a lot with mold shops on. So I wanted him to walk through this data analysis with you. So James.
Hey everyone, my name is James Murphy. You've probably seen me in and around some of the AMBA conferences or some of the technical conferences throughout the U.S. If not, my name is James again. I've been with Harbour Results for about 1.5 years. And what I've done for the purpose of this webinar is I've created an example Excel file. And I'll go through that shortly. But kind of what I want to do is walk through what data should be collected. I just wrote some bullets here as it relates to some of the more salesy type of things. Most of you guys are already collecting information on sales, quote volume, hit rate. You're probably tracking your cost per customer, per mold type. We talk about tracking data by individual customer, not necessarily just by individual job. And we also want to know, how does that tie back to some of the overall industry stuff that you guys might be performing in? So, as easy it might be to only think that the tooling industry exists in a vacuum, however, there are a lot of external influences that factor into the tooling industry's performance. So what can be a little unclear when you combine all this information is, what are the connections? Usually a lot of the stuff that we see is very interconnected and has some level of correlation or drive on something else. So for instance, if we're talking about profit, what might not be easy to understand or hidden within the data is that maybe somehow the mold type or the mold size, or actually something back into the volume of you're doing with the quotes affects your bottom line. And when we don't collect and analyze that information, we don't know, and we don't know how to plan for it. So what type of analysis makes sense? I'll walk through this example here shortly, but what I'll do is I'll start off with some raw data. I created about 100 example molds in an Excel file, and we'll walk through how I might structure it and how I've seen some other mold shops structure the data. And what will become clear is that there's a lot of ways to do it, and there is no perfect way to structure data. It is very dependent sometimes by facility, and that we will walk through what are some of the insights that we can get out pretty quickly without knowing a whole lot about Excel. So if you're scared to open Excel, or you only open it on accidents, I'll apologize in advance. That's where the example will take place. But there are other technologies I'm sure that you guys could use to do this. And before we jump in, what we're going to try to figure out is, what's the data telling me? Sometimes when I go into places, I'll ask, who are your best customers? And they might be like, oh, definitely this person. And the obvious question I might have is, how do you know? Well, I have the most sales with them. Well, that's great, but, where's your profitability coming from? Well, it's coming from this person. So, you want to just start asking questions. I'm sure a lot of you are already doing that, but what we want to really do is ask these questions in a very structured and strategic method. Quoting return on investment, I won't go through a quoting example today, but you guys can reach out to me if you'd like. That's really understanding how much am I quoting the customers that I currently have? Am I getting the right hit rate from the customers I want to be working with? And what's that look like? How is that affecting my sales volumes? How is it affecting how I level load some of the work coming in? And then what does that mean moving forward? I briefly talked about profitable work. This could be broken down a lot of ways. I'll break it down here on the example here shortly. But some of this has to do with a lot of where are the growth opportunities at? Is your growth opportunity really with your number one customer? It might be. Maybe it's diversification within that customer, or maybe it's outside of that industry that you're currently most comfortable in. So I don't want you to get the impression that it's, hey, maybe I should go jump from aerospace to medical. No, that's not what we're sitting here recommending. We just got to be knowing where our best work is and where's the data pointing us to go. And then cost leaders, we'll talk about margin here, how it relates to profit, and then we'll dive in specifically how that connects to the various molds that we're making. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and exit the PowerPoint. I'm going to open Excel. So hopefully everyone can see this okay. If you can't, type something in the chat box. Hopefully I'll be able to see it okay. So what you see here is a lot of information. I built an Excel file that's got 100 different molds in it, and I put some generic information in. I put mold number, how much the sale was, how much it cost. This is just from a manufacturing cost standpoint. What the profit was, more or less, margin, and then I put in some information around who the customer was, what the mold type, industry, and what the mold size was. This is all just example information. I recommend this is probably a pretty straightforward way to structure data. And I realize that the reality is that not everyone's going to have all of this easily available all at the same time. So we'll talk about maybe if you don't have some of this stuff, what best is it to, what do you do if you have only a partial data? So when you look at this information, it's not really clear what we're learning. Now within a table, I can sort largest to smallest, and I can see that, wow, I've got these 3 large molds here that all happen to be in automotive. They're all plastic injection, 2 white customers, 1 green customer. The average margin per tool wasn't all that great. But is that really enough to go off of? What can I really do with this? So what I've done in this Excel file is I've pre-built several tabs, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create pivot tables and walk through ways to look at information. We'll start with single cut analyses, and then we'll walk through what maybe dual cuts look like. We'll explain that when we get there, to graphing information, and maybe for some that's easier to work with. So go ahead and jump into it. The first thing I looked at was how many molds am I making for each customer, and what's the total sales that I'm also experiencing for each customer. So what I found was that looks like the total sales for customer red was 603,000, and total sales for customer white was 602,000. That's interesting. I mean, that's that's 1.2 million of my 2.7 million total sales. That's a pretty significant chunk. The thing that kind of jumps out to me a little bit is, we've got 24 molds made for customer red and 18 molds made for customer white. what may be some sort of inference there would be the average sale price per mold at customer white is a little higher, and then we can kind of have some trail off here moving down. Now, we're not necessarily going to say, hey, these are bad customers, you should weed out these customers, because the question I would have back at you is, how do you know these are bad customers? Just because customer red and white are leading in sales, does that mean they're really good customers for your business? I think what we'll have to do here is add in some more data to understand what the total story is. And the ongoing analogy I like to use sometimes is that imagine you're driving your car and the only access to information you have is your speed or what gear you're in. Is that a clear indicator of how well your car is performing? I think everyone would easily say no. So no one's just going to look at sales data and make their decisions. So let's go ahead and add in a different way of looking at it. So all I've done in this tab is I've converted total sales, so 603, 602, 280, to percent of total sales. So you notice that these are pretty close. We would expect that. So customer tan, for instance, was 10.1% of our total sales for the fiscal year. Now, I recommend looking at information as far as percentage-based because it can be a little easier to work with, but also the numbers are a lot smaller. And I think that works best because when I start pulling in other data sets into this pivot table, it'll start to become more clear what is good and maybe what is not so good. So let's go ahead and bounce to the next tab. And what I've done now is I've added in average margin per tool shipped. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, let's look at customer yellow. Customer yellow, we built and shipped 8 molds to. They represented 7.9% of our annual sales or fiscal year sales, however you want to look at it. However, they represented 29.5% average margin. I would say 29.5% average margin on tools built is very strong. There are some customers that are below that. So let's look at customer green. Average margin per tool, 8%. Not so high. Customer white, one of our best customers, average margin 13%. Well, I mean, customer white did represent a large part of our sales, but it does look like customer tan, who only represented 1/10 of our sales, actually represented more profit than customer white. Now, is it necessarily clear right off the bat whether or not we should do anything with that? Difficult to tell. We'll start adding some more analytics and more analyses into this example as we go. But what you start to find is that when you add in more perspectives, the story does tend to change a little bit and give you a more clear understanding where you should go and how that should tie into your strategy. So what we find here is, some of these cats and dogs down here actually had pretty good average margin per tools. If I was only looking at sales information like I was in the previous tab, I'd say these aren't probably great customers for us. However, my initial reaction would be looking at average margin, maybe I need to be doing more work with these customers and less work with customer white. So as we move on, now I've added in sum of profit. So what I've noticed now is I've moved margin over and I've brought in profit. So we've looked at total sales, we've looked at average margin per tool. Now we're looking at profit as a whole. So what this meant was, if you guys remember, customer red was just a little north of $600,000 per year in sales, so 21.7%. However, they represent 24.8% of profit. Ideally, what we would want to see is that the profit is higher than sales. This is just meaning that real quickly, they're probably a good customer for us. Now, if we look at customer white, they represent 13% of our total profit. However, they were equal in sales, so that's an interesting dynamic. Customer tan, like I talked about in the previous tab, we did build 10 molds for them. Average margin per tool, 22.6%. And they were about the same level of contribution as far as bottom line profit, or gross, or however you want to look at it, than the customer that you spent significantly more time with. So we would say maybe as far as efficiency goes, 21.7%. That's roughly, a fifth of your overall capacity in your plant if you're running 100%. However, you've got a customer that you spend half the time with, but almost got the same amount of profit. Pretty interesting there. You know what? And I'm not making this up. When I made up this file, I have seen this at actual plant sites. And most people don't know this off the bat. Sometimes it's unattended, sometimes it's intended. It really depends on the strategy. And then we start looking at some of these customers down here. We do see some differences. Now, customer green, this is an interesting example. They represented almost 10% of our total sales. However, they almost had no implication to the bottom line. So this would make me wonder, do I really need to continue working with customer green? And then orange down here, we're actually losing money on customer orange. Moving on, I pose a question here. Customer red and white have similar sales. However, why is it different margins? And this is where we'll want to start bringing in other data pieces that I had on the sample data tab back here at the beginning. So what we'll start to bring in here is industry that these customers are participating in, what types of molds are we making for them, and what are the size of the molds. When we start combining this information, we'll start to gain a more clear picture about what the data is telling us. Now, I realize it just jumps quite a bit, so all I did between this tab and this tab was I added in the type of molds that we're making for these customers. And you'll notice over here when I click in this table, I get this what's called a field list that pops up in Excel. Probably a lot of you already know what this is. This is how you build pivot tables. I've dropped mold type under customer. But the only reason I wanted to show this is I wanted to kind of see what are the key differences. So for red and white, we can't say, well, it's because we make a certain type of mold for red, and well, they're both plastic injections, so that's not the root cause. However, if we start looking at some of these other ones, we've got compression molds, we've got die cast molds. There's a lot of stuff going on here. This isn't really a great way to look at the data, but I just wanted to show you guys that you can do this as well. So whatever works for you best as far as different cuts go, feel free to experiment with that. What we find is sometimes there is some level of trial and error in data analytics. You'll eventually get to what's the most beneficial, but sometimes it does take a couple opportunities to figure out what works best for your organization. Now, what I've done on this slide is I've replaced the customers here in column A with the types of molds that we make. So we've got plastic injection, compression, and die cast. So I've left here the same information that I've had previously: total number of molds shipped, percent of total sales, percent of total profit, and average margin per tool. So what we'll notice is that 80 out of our 100 total tools made, or 80%, were plastic injection. They represented nearly 80% of our total sales, 76% of our total profit, and their average margin was nearly 22% per tool. Compression, on the other hand, 12 tools made for compression, they represent still only about 13% of our total sales. But if we look at profit here, we start to see that, wow, we've got quite the swing for the profit. So what I would have hoped to have seen was that plastic injection, while they accounted for 80% of our sales, should they represent 80% of our profit? I don't know. That's a question you guys will have to ask yourselves to figure out what's the story telling you. Compression, I would say that this is a very good maybe business for you that you could be exploring further. So the average margin per tool is 33.6%. That's very strong. Then we look at die cast. My immediate question looking at this would be, more or less, why are you still in die cast? Now, I realize this is total example information. Could be a strategy. It could be, look, we do die cast molds with customer red, so we could do compression molds with that same customer. Maybe it's some sort of leading strategy. you'll have to look at that. But it could be an opportunity for you to, what we call weed the garden, or really understand where you could be, siphoning out work and replacing it with better work. Now let's continue the analysis, and let's replace mold type with mold size. Now I've created categories for small, medium, and large. You guys can create your own categories. This was really just based off of how much the mold costs, but you can restructure it to be tonnage if you'd like. What we'll find here is that medium-sized molds, they accounted for 46% of all molds built for the year. It's nice that I just went ahead and used 100. So if we look at this, so medium-sized molds, 39.6% of total sales, pretty high profit. Look at this, 51% of total profit, 24% average margin per tool, pretty good. Now large tools, on the other hand, I've highlighted with a nice red box rectangle for a reason. So they're about a quarter of our total capacity at 28 molds per year, but 50% of total sales. You'll have to excuse me, 28 molds, but 50% of our total capacity are sales. So that's a pretty big chunk there. Now, they do only represent 37% of profit, which isn't too bad, but their margin is only 15.3%. We would say, what's going on there? That's something that's kind of jumping out at me. I've got small and medium-sized tools that I'm getting average margin north of 24%. However, large tools that are big sales for our company are only getting average margin of 15%. What's going on there? Is that good? Is that bad? How does that relate to some of the other stuff that you're working on? Do you know intuitively if large molds run well through your organization? That's where you'll have to combine some of your toolmaker and business knowledge with some of the analytics that you're seeing. Now the next tab is going to be focused on industry. Some of you guys, this will be various industries. This could be different types of commodities within the same type of industry. This is representative information. So we've got aerospace, automotive, marine, and medical. We find here that medical represents 51 of our total molds made for the year. Percent of sales is 45%, and average margin is 22. Now, automotive, on the other hand, we've got a quarter of all our molds made were automotive. They represented 30% of sales. But if we look at profit and margin, that's not very good. Something's going on there. Excuse me. So, this question kind of begs further analysis. We've looked at information by customer. We looked at information by mold type, mold size, and industry served. So we've all looked at this, and now what we try to figure out is what's next. So the analysis that we've done thus far is what we'd call just pretty much singular analysis or single data point analysis, where we're just looking at a series of information here in column A, and then we're looking at what's going on over here. Now, what we typically tend to do is we say this is good information to start with, but we want to look at it in multiple ways, what we call maybe a dual analysis or a two-cut. So I'm going to click on this next slide, and I realize that I've now added in conditional formatting or these color codes, so you'll have to bear with me as I explain it. I've put your customers across row 4 here across the top, and I've put industries. I've kept that in column A. Now what this information in here is a percent of total sales as a total of your, percent of total sales. So what this means is that customer white, 20.5% of your total sales for the year were customer white within automotive. That's what this is saying. Either you can use conditional formatting or not, it's up to you, but what it helps me identify instantly is where are some key trends at, where are these specific things that I need to be looking at. And you'll notice some of these other items as well. So we see quite a bit of highlighting down here in medical, or we would expect that given that 45% of our work is in medical. We only have 2 customers who are doing automotive, customer green and customer white. Only 2 here in marine. So what's going on there? So this is just a really easy way of looking at the information. And so now we've brought in 2 factors. So the next thing I'm going to look at, and you'll have to forgive me, I will have to explain what's going on with the color coding here. So I looked at percent of total sales up here at the top pivot table. That didn't change from the previous tab. But if I look at percent of total profit right below, this starts to give us kind of a clear picture or another picture as far as what's good and what's not so good. So kind of highlighted the same, red, you can use different colors if you'd like. Red is kind of highlighting where the hot spots are at, and blue is highlighting the cool spots. The reason why the 0.0% are blue up here and not down here is that we've got a negative 0.2% down here. So let's look at some of these things again. So customer black, whose only work is in marine, is 7.1% of our total sales. However, he's nearly 12% of our total profit. That's an interesting thing to look at. Maybe I need to be doing more work with customer black and marine. Same thing with customer blue and medical. If we look at orange in automotive, in medical, excuse me, we see that 3.7%. Not a whole lot, not a substantial amount. However, they're causing us to lose money, and as far as profit goes. Now, if we look at customer white, which I highlighted for percent of total sales, this is a pretty big chunk. This is a big account. And most likely you're servicing the account very well, you're trying to grow it. However, there's a substantial drop for you on as far as profit goes. We see it go from 20.5% of total sales to 11.6% of total profit. And really, just once you start asking, it's like, wow, why is that? What's going on? So what I've done on this pivot table down here is I've brought in, size of molds. I realize this could get confusing, so I'm just going to briefly click open this automotive piece down here, and we can then look at, okay, within automotive with size of molds, where's my money coming from? Where's the profit? So this 1.9, 3.8, and 6.1 should sum to 11.8 there. So where is it coming from? Okay, so we've got a little bit here with large. It looks like most of our work in automotive is done here on the large scale, maybe a couple medium right here. But, so trying to figure out more specifically, if you told me, wow, I'm not doing well with white in automotive, I'd ask you, okay, well, what's driving that? Okay, well, it appears to be maybe small automotive molds for customer whites, and then you can see what's going on here as a percent of total profit.
So just one other additional thing to add to James's analysis is, as you see, he's gone over to what he called multidimensional analysis, and the goal here is to help drill down to where the issues are, right? So in the initial analysis, we found, wow, automotive doesn't seem to be very profitable for us. Well, why is that? And within this, you can see it really relies within 2 specific customers. And then when you drill down even further to size of tool, it starts to help create the problem-solving activity. So whether that's sales looking at it and saying, hey, I'm leaving money on the table, I need to look at how I deal with that customer, or maybe it's where you put your operational focus to say, look, we can't get out of business with customer white. We're going to stay in automotive, so we've got to find a way operationally to make improvement. So all of this multidimensional is about drilling down deeper so we can focus our problem solving where the effort needs to be placed.
Yep. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this same style of analysis and let's push it forward just a little bit. You can see I've left the customers up here as far as on top of the tables, and I've put types of molds and size of molds. This is just another way of looking at information. This is pretty quick. So once you put this information in a pivot table, you can structure it however you want. So for example, if I wanted to put, customers here back on the column side and types of molds or size of molds back across the the x-axis up here. That's pretty easy to do, and then you can put whatever you want here as far as values go. You could look at, total sales. You could look at percentage breakdowns. Like I said, I prefer to look at percent breakdowns because I think they highlight a little better. So let's look at information as far as total profit goes for compression, die cast, and plastic injection molding. We see here that we've got a couple blues that pop up. We've got a loss leader with customer orange and die cast and customer tan and die cast. I guess what this is maybe indicating is that maybe die cast is not so good for your business. It may be in real life. But with these specific customers, it's just not working. Could it be working with other customers? Maybe. And maybe this is a specific strategy that you have with these customers to do a die cast work. Now, if we look at customer red, plastic injection, we're getting a lot of our profit from them. There, customer white, we got another kind of one that's popping out with plastic injection. So it looks like plastic injection and compression molds, which you probably already know intuitively, were actually contributing to our bottom line the most. But then we could see which customers are actually supporting us more than others. You could look at customer green, customer orange, and some of these other smaller ones that maybe you're like, I don't know if I want to continue to work with these guys. Maybe that's what comes out of that. So, excuse me, throat's a little dry. Now, if I look at this type of information as well from size of mold, we could start then to see that where am I getting my best at? Now, I do have this hot spot here for medium-sized molds. I do have some blue over here. So, what you don't want to say is that, wow, I should jump directly into medium-sized molds alone. Well, because you're actually losing money over here with some medium-sized molds. So you need to look at the total picture. We knew up here that we were losing some money with die cast molds, but that's not exactly what's explaining some of this. And then large tools, it looks like we're getting some pretty decent profit contributions. However, the profit contribution with these guys is not looking so hot. And this is just another way of looking at information, just to kind of glean analysis as fast as possible. And one other example real quick before I get into maybe some charting. I looked at this, I put the information we were just looking at. I removed customers from this, and I put type of mold over here and size of mold. So what we'll notice is that, this is percent of sales, and down here is percent of profits. So medium-sized plastic injection molds were 33% of our total sales. However, medium plastic injection molds were 43% of our total profit. So that's an interesting insight that we want to keep track of. Large molds for plastic injection, 38% of total sales, were only 25% of total profit. So that would mean that we're not necessarily making as much money on large plastic injection tools as we are medium-sized plastic injection tools. And then die cast, then again, is still kind of running here in the cooler colors. So another way of looking at information, which I prefer personally, and I guess it really just depends on your preference, is I like to look at information graphically. When I'm in a lot of mold shops and we're looking through data, what I've noticed pretty quickly is, a lot of people are already creating graphs and charts and looking at this type of stuff. I personally find that to be the easiest thing to do. Insights don't necessarily jump out at you when they're in tabular format. So let's look at this combo chart I made. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. So all I'm doing here is on this primary y-axis, I've got total annual sales. So we'll find that customer red, which is right here, had 603 total sales. Customer tan, 280, and then I'm just sorting high to low. On the secondary y-axis, I've got profit as a percent of total. So I'm trying to figure out, okay, how much did they contribute in sales, and then how much did they contribute in profit? Now, the thing that jumps out, like I think it did on the previous format early on the look at this example, was white is very high as far as total sales, but then we have this pretty significant drop-off per percent of profit. However, if we look at some of these guys over here, you could argue that this line is incredibly close to this line over here. However, you're spending like a third of the amount of time to get the same amount of profit. So that's a pretty incredible insight to get out of this. Now, there could be a lot of reasons for that. It could be the relationship that you have with that current vendor. It could be maybe a strategic decision to get more involved in a certain industry. There could be a lot of specific reasons why this is happening. But looking at this data right here, I would say, wow, it looks like we might want to go ahead and increase this type of information. So looking at this, I would say we should probably look to grab this data set and try to work on these sales to contribute to our overall. Because what we don't want to do, and what I see this quite a bit at mold shops and dye shops, is that, well, what do you want to do? Well, I want to grow sales. Okay, how are you going to grow sales? Well, I'm going to focus on my best customers. All right, so are you comfortable with the scenario of increasing sales while decreasing profit potentially? I think everyone's going to say no. With more sales comes more complexity. So they want to kind of maximize some of the things that they're currently doing. So that was looking at a combo chart here. And then another way I like to look at it is kind of a cluster analysis. And this is a specific technique of plotting 3 sets of data. So you'll have access to these files. I believe Susan mentioned we'll post these afterwards. So what this is showing across the y-axis here is annual sales per year. And then down here across the x-axis, we have average margin per tool. And then the size of the bubble is the number of tools shipped. So that's how I've created kind of a 3-dimensional analysis. So what we'll notice right off the bat is we've got customer red up here. That's good. Well, customer white's back here. That's not so good. We see quite the drop-off. So if we're only looking at graphically, we can see that that's a problem. And then we've got some smaller guys over here. Well, what's going on with this group of customers? We got kind of what we'd call a cluster. And this is where the cluster analysis comes in from. Really, this is, what you want to start with is a scatter plot or a bubble chart. Whatever works for you. Sometimes scatter plots are easier to do. They're 2-dimensional analyses. But with a bubble chart that does give you some level of scope or some sort of z-axis point of view. And then what I've done is I've just really circled this cluster of groups. Now I could easily circle this group over here, and I can circle these guys, and what I'd probably figure out is I've got, for the most part, 3 types of customers is what this is going to tell me. But what I'd argue right here is that these guys have something in common. Their average margin of tool is pretty high. It's north of 20%. Some of them are getting almost a 35% on average per tool. That's very strong. So another technique you can be like is I'm going to focus on these guys right here, and what you'll probably find is it does match the arrow that I drew on the previous tab. Now there's a lot of different charts, graphics, pivot tables, regular tables, and other sorts of analyses that you can do. If you were to ask me, okay, well, how should I structure my information? The consultant side of me is going to say it depends. I know people don't like that answer, but it really depends on some of the information that you have available and what you're wanting to do with it. And it can depend on, what's the message trying to, what are you trying to get out of the data? So I've covered this in Excel. We can come back if there's any questions, but I kind of want to jump back to the PowerPoint to try to, put a bow on this. So what Lori kind of teed off right off the bat was this was our strategic sales process, and I was just going to cover the sales and profitability analysis piece of it. Where I think it makes sense for a lot of you to start immediately, if you're not already doing it, is to do the same type of analysis for hit rate, quote volume, and also sales that we just did. But as you can see, that's a small piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of other things that go into managing sales on a yearly basis, and you guys know how complicated some of these sales techniques can be.
And based on the data that James showed you in the example, and based on what your data says, it should lead you back to, what is my company strategy? Did the data, oftentimes we'll see in the data that companies will have sort of unintended strategies, right? Where we said, hey, we're going to focus on these types of molds because it does, this type of profitability for us. But the data might yield something else because maybe we work diligently to fill our shop with certain types of data. Or maybe we accidentally took on compression molds because it was strategic with a customer and we found, hey, we're really good at them, and that was sort of an unintended strategy. And so you have to tie this data analysis into everything to build your strategies, build your target markets. If the data tells you you want to focus on that cluster James just showed you, then you might go into your target markets and say, let's look at these 4 customers and let's develop a tool to understand how we filter those customers through to make sure we get to that type of product and type of customer that we want. So there's a lot in this chart that we've shared with you, but companies have to start somewhere, and we really believe that the data portion of it is the first place that companies have to start. And I think, James, as you go to your summary, we can point at some things that maybe you can get started with.
Sure. So, kind of as I alluded to, no one-size-fits-all solution is really out there. Now, I recommend maybe starting with some of the things that I started with as far as sales, profit, cost, margin, and then I threw some other things in there, and it may or may not be readily available for you guys, as far as types of molds, size of molds, and end-use industries. When you start to put all that information together, you start to get some pretty clear ideas where you should be going. And you guys could probably think of other things as well that you could add in that's going to be very dependent as far as what types of molds you make and where you're actually geographically located. Analyze the data monthly. Sometimes I have to push back on folks that say, hey, I want to do this more frequently. It's not that easy. And putting together the information, more frequently than monthly sometimes can be too much. So I would say you guys are closing your books on a monthly basis. Pull that data into some of your sales stuff and say, what's going on? Now, there are easy and repeatable ways to do this. I won't cover it right this second, where you can add in your newest information, refresh your charts that you have, and see what the story tells you. I know some of you guys are already doing that already. And then start asking questions like why? What's going on there? What's the root cause? There are some different techniques you could use that are very, the lean manufacturing approach, whether that's a fishbone diagram or just asking 5Y or 8D, whatever works for you, but really to get down to the root cause, what's causing this? And if you start asking why, you can start getting some answers. Feedback loop, you want to be able to do something with the information. So once you've settled on the information you're going to collect and you start analyzing it, then you start using that maybe as potential metrics, you need to remeasure and say, am I looking at the right stuff? Am I performing better given the data that I'm collecting? And it should be a constant feedback loop. And then this data within the feedback loop system drives your strategic plan. So, if it comes back to, hey, my metric now is my average margin per tool needs to be 25%, well, then start tracking it. Start tracking it and seeing how you're performing by some of the cuts that I showed you guys early on. So what next? And so I wanted to kind of give you guys something that you can go do immediately, because I think that's pretty important. None of this is necessarily rocket science. You may or may not have different levels of comfortability with doing this type of stuff. Your ERP system could be better or worse. You could be collecting this information on paper and filing cabinets. There are varying degrees of success with this. But start to figure out, what data do I have? You at least want to figure out what you've got right now, and then figure out, what data should I have? I'm not saying you should have everything that I just walked through. I created a real nice kind of vacuum sealed analysis, but you really need to understand, well, what information do I need to have to be a more successful tool shop? And it is going to depend on what your strategy is. If you have a growth strategy, well, then that's going to look a little different. If it's, hey, I want to grow maybe just 1.5%, but I want to grow my margin by 3%, that data collection system looks a lot different too. And then begin to compile the data. Whether it's you personally or someone within your organization, start collecting the data on a monthly basis and figure out ways to make that as easy as possible. Compile the data and then begin the process of analyzing it. Really understand, what is this telling me? Sometimes if you just put it in tables, maybe you'll get analyses that jump right out at you. That's nice. But you also may need to restructure it and create some different metrics. Maybe it's revenue per tool. Maybe it's average margin per tool. Maybe it's profit per whatever. Figure out what makes sense for your shop and then go and do it. Once you start doing things, then you can iterate from there. Kind of the ongoing joke we have here at the office is, don't let perfect get in the way of progress, because sometimes it's a little easier to iterate on things that are already existing than to try to create the perfect thing right off the bat. So with that, we'll probably move on here towards the wrap-up piece. I'll be more than happy to come back later on and answer any questions you guys might have.
I did get one question sent to me, James. Do you have any historic data on the number of new molds built by type, industry, or geography?
As far as like historical data from previous years?
John, if you'd like to weigh in on that.
I'm assuming you mean benchmarking data from other companies, is that correct?
Yes, historic data by years or current data.
So as far as, I recently collected information on a survey that collected total tools shipped for 2014, 2015, and early 2016. We're actually in the process of analyzing that information. We're wrapping up the validation and vetting process, and we will be publishing a report, hopefully within the next couple weeks, that will have this types of information. So, we went out and collected sales, quoting information, some level of profitability, but we also captured a number of tools. So I think once we do that analysis, we'll be able to show you what the trend is between mold and die, if you'd like to see that, by the size of the companies involved within the study and where they are located. So hopefully that answers your question.
He said that's great and he can't wait to see it.
All right.
So I'm going to work to wrap this up here in the next sort of minute. The last thing I just really want to leave you with is we wanted to make sure that we shared a little bit about the partnership with AMBA and Harbour IQ, because we feel both through the AMBA and through Harbour that not everyone on the AMBA is aware of what's available to you. That question is a great question about information and benchmarking data, that once you now compile your own data, the natural question becomes, boy, I wonder how some other people do it. And so we've, in our relationship with Harbour IQ and with AMBA, our focus is on helping companies gather the data they need to make decisions. That's what Harbour IQ is about. But if you go to this next piece, I want to show you the actual website of AMBA, because for some of you, you may be aware of this, but when you log on to your AMBA website, you see this tab called Industry Data. And in that industry data, you see this home page that gives you benchmarking and white papers and the latest survey results. And what we do is we're regularly giving data about once a month to the AMBA team, and they're posting that information on the AMBA site. So this is just an example of some of the performance benchmarking. For those of you who are in automotive, you have some access to some automotive forecasting data that you can download. So there's all kinds of PDFs on performance data, market intelligence, forecasting information. So as you're gathering your own data and you say, hey, I wonder now when I build my sales plan, what vehicle programs are coming, you can go onto your own AMBA website and log in and download LMC forecasting data to give you that other external piece of data to help you kind of, tie that with your internal data to help make better sales decisions and plans going forward. Additionally, each member of the AMBA receives once a month a AMBA tooling insight, which is coming from Harbour IQ, and in that we're essentially pushing information to you. So even if you don't have time or the ability to go onto the AMBA site, although I know AMBA and us would like you to, in this insight you're getting access to additional information like our quarterly report, like our survey results. So the survey James just indicated that he executed, he will develop a report, we will give that to AMBA, it'll get pushed to you through the insight, and then you'll also be able to find it on the website itself. So there's a tremendous amount of information that's available to all of you in terms of benchmarking that you can obtain through the AMBA site. And then the last piece of it is probably a little bit more of the selfish plug for Harbour IQ on those, that the information that all of you want to receive that may be beyond what you see on the AMBA. Our Harbour IQ client offering is really, the cornerstone of that is these consulting visits. We're meeting on a quarterly basis with Harbour IQ clients, and we're sharing trends in the industry, we're sharing data and information from both their data as well as benchmark data, and having an honest and open exchange. Some of those companies that we've spent time with, we've been working on sales strategies. So that's the opportunity within additional information beyond the AMBA. And then lastly, we offer a substantial discount on our 2-day assessment program through the AMBA. The normal price of an assessment is $12,000 for 2 days, and we offer a discount to $7,500 for AMBA members. And it's a 2-day process where 3 people come and analyze the entire operation and provide you with recommendations for improvement. And that again allows you to see more information and data, and frankly we're getting into a lot of these discussions around sales and how to make improvement through our recommendations in those assessments. So that's all of the information that we have for you. I know we're up against our timeline, so I apologize for that, but we'd be happy to answer any other questions that anybody might have. And also, again, we would be happy to take this to a phase 2 discussion of where to from here if people are interested in that as well.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much, James and Lori, for all of the information, sharing that with the members. Everyone, again, we will be posting the recorded webinar and the presentation to the AMBA website for your convenience. And we thank you all, and have a great afternoon.